Hello, and welcome to Books in the World. I'm your host, Kathleen Murphy. Books in the World is an interview show produced by the Cape Cod Writers Center and the Cape Media Center. The Writers Center was established 60 years ago and sponsors a 4-day writers conference every summer on Cape Cod. Books in the World has been broadcast continuously for 45 years, making it the longest-running program of its kind in the United States. The goal of the program is to show how writers, illustrators, publishers, editors, and others in the literary field play their roles in the world of books and other communication media. Today, we are delighted to welcome Elizabeth Winthrop Alsop and talk to her about her latest book, Daughter of Spies. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me.
An award-winning author with over 60 published works of fiction, Elizabeth's short fiction has appeared in Best American Short Stories and Fiction 100. Twice a winner of the Penn Syndicated Fiction Award, she is also the author of over 40 books for children, among them her highly acclaimed novel, The Castle in the Attic. This book, Daughter of Spies, is a memoir. It's beautifully written and manages to both reveal and honor Elizabeth's parents. It left me with lasting images from all of the family's lives. Her teenage mother working as a code breaker through the London bombings of World War II, her father parachuting into France, the author herself learning to swim. Woven through the narrative is the author's personal struggle as a caregiver toward the end of her mother's life, with whom she had a complicated relationship. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So thank you again, Elizabeth, and welcome.
Thank you.
So tell me about this book. Tell me about The Daughter of Spies, please.
So my mother very rarely talked about herself. She was 18 when she married my father. She crossed the North Atlantic in convoy, dodging U-boats, pregnant with my oldest brother, Joe. And when she arrived in this country, she really knew nobody. And she was shy and remote. And my father was a famous journalist, and he kind of held the spotlight through our childhood. So it wasn't until he had died and my mother had sort of rebirthed herself as a medical research technologist that I began to ask her, but Mommy, we don't know about your childhood. And that's when the stories came spilling out. And I was told by William Zinsser, who's the great critic or writer about writing. He wrote a book called On Writing Well. And I went to see him one day and I said, I'm writing a memoir about my parents. And he said, you can't write about both of them at the same time. And I said, I'll prove you wrong. And I left. And 2 years later, he was right. My father's had written his own memoir. There were books written about him, plays written about him. His story was out there, but nobody knew my mother's story. And that wasn't fair. And I am the only girl in 6 children. I have 5 brothers, and they didn't know anything about my mother, certainly. So this was, it started out as a kind of an act of love. And then I realized when you write a memoir, you have to keep peeling away the onion, the layers. And I got down to the real core of, as you put it so beautifully, a very complicated relationship.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. But this is a real departure for you. You've had a very long and successful writing career. Your middle-aged book, The Castle in the Attic, was nominated for 23 state book awards. And many of your over 40 children's books have received awards and very high praise. But the book we're talking about today is nonfiction. It's a memoir. So
right.
How was that transition from fiction to nonfiction? And what challenges did you have? Did you have any surprises?
Yes. So the first thing was I thought I could write it as a novel. I, of course, wanted to, duck back into my fictional. I always think of fiction writers as the Wizard of Oz, do not look at the person behind the curtain. I'm speaking through my characters. But when I started to write it, it was so clearly a reported story. I wasn't there. I'd done enormous amounts of research. I'd interviewed her. I'd read my father's memoir, et cetera, but it was flat on the page. So
Mhm.
I said, all right, I have to bring myself into this story. And that's when I decided A, memoir, and B, to make it a braided narrative, which, as you say, in part one, I go back and forth between my mother's childhood in Gibraltar, the day she met my father in a baronial castle in Yorkshire, the day her only brother was killed by the Germans. So, I mean, there were wonderfully weird and romantic parts of it, but I would go back and forth from those times, the 1940s, to the present day. And we would be talking, unfortunately, about bed sores and dementia. And it gave me a way to stay in the story. And that's what really pushed, I think, the memoir. And then the interesting thing is, you ask, did I learn anything? When I got to part two, which is my childhood growing up, I dropped my braided narrative, which you may or may not have noticed.
Yeah.
And part of that is I grew up in the shadow of my mother's alcoholism, and it took over the stage. And that's why I became a caretaker for my younger brothers, etc. So I didn't want her on the stage. I wanted her in part two to be seen only through the eyes of a child.
Right.
And in part three, I go back to the braided narrative. But that was a revelation to me. I thought I had worked through all of my issues with the alcoholism and the distant parents. But in fact, in the memoir, I got right back to that childhood emotion.
Yeah.
And I felt it most strongly when I watched her in her dementia be very snappy and impatient with the caregivers. I
Yeah.
would suddenly want to go in and take care of them the way I had taken care of my younger brothers when she was snappy and impatient because of drink.
Yeah.
So it triggered childhood emotions, and I'm sure that's true for everybody who writes a memoir.
I
It's
can
you dig
imagine.
deep.
And I
Yeah,
did notice it when the differences between part one, part two, and part three, and the fiction aspect of it, when you're talking to your mom and you're writing about her history, you couldn't say how she felt about the things that
no,
had happened to her, when she's crossing the boat to go from Spain to England, and it turns out to be
mhm.
the first day of the Dunkirk debacle,
Evacuation.
the
Yeah, yeah,
evacuation. Exactly. So you couldn't really get how she felt about it. So you were able to kind of fill in some of her personality because of that. But
hmm,
it still was obviously, you had to maintain some detachment,
yeah,
with that. And then in the middle, yes, you could freely talk about how you felt. So you could imbue it
yeah.
with the emotion and really, helped us to see what it was like to be the child of an
The
alcoholic,
child, yeah, of
right?
these two parents. Yeah, my
Yeah.
mother, when she began to talk about things like the Dunkirk evacuation, you couldn't get any emotion from her because she was British, keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
And she was also brought up in the war. So she said, we felt we were immortal. I
Yeah.
was 18, I would live forever. That bomb would miss me, that bomb would miss me.
Right.
And yet, when she described Dunkirk, she had very telling details. It was a bluebird day. I'll never forget that line.
Yeah.
And the lines about the barrage balloons going overhead and the boats crossing their bows. It was, she pictured
Yeah.
it, she grabbed it. So she was a real storyteller.
She really, really was. And
Yeah,
you also, in your growing up, we transitioned from the World War II aspect of it to the Cold War aspect of
yeah,
it. And there you were intimately connected with the people that were writing about it and the people that were making decisions that
yeah,
influenced it. And you're a kid. And just
yeah,
like your mother felt immortal and nothing could affect her, all kids are like that, right? So
yeah,
here you
yeah.
are, and you're an accomplice to
It's
a lot
true.
of antics from you and your brothers,
Yeah,
whilst these power brokers of the world are having
yeah,
dinner in
yeah,
your own home.
yeah,
Amazing.
yeah. It was funny because all of Daddy's best friends, or many of his best friends, worked in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, during the war, and that's why he dropped behind enemy lines into France and liaisoned with the resistance, the Maquis in France. When they all came home to Washington, a lot of them were, lawyers in New York or whatever, they missed the excitement. And so they drifted down to Washington and ended up in the CIA. So, for example, my godfather, Tom Braden, who wrote Eight is Enough, which is what he's known for, he was in the CIA. He was, so we were surrounded by these people, and you had the real sense of secrecy and mystery, and my father getting secrets out of these power brokers and trying to decide what he could use in a column and what he couldn't. He was debriefed by the CIA every time he came home from abroad. So there was this Cold War was that way anyway in Washington, but then you add the layer of the two of the parents who were keeping secrets from each other because that was the habit.
Yeah.
My mother had signed the Official Secrets Act in 1943. She held on to that. She didn't tell my father.
Yeah, she was bound to
by
not
it.
reveal the things that she had done. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And he did not tell her where he was jumping. I mean, she assumed it was France, but she didn't know where.
Right.
So they got into that habit. So the house was full of that growing up, this sort of sense of power, secrecy to get. And so as a result, my oldest brother, Joe, who was a real electronic engineer genius, we bugged my father's dinner party and took a tape recording of his dinner party.
Right.
As I say in the book, mainly you just heard a lot of clinking of glasses. We didn't get any secrets, but we were sort of using the same techniques that the spies did.
Yeah.
And bringing it home.
Yeah, what really struck me was that obviously your parents were serious and working very hard to live their lives in a way that was going to benefit, or fight communism basically at the time.
Sure.
And so there was this attitude, as you say, but it's amazing to me how you guys were, you children were sponges. You didn't know what you were picking up, but
That's
you
right.
got that feeling and you reacted to it. I mean, it was a clear, what happens in the home, the kids pick up everything.
That's right.
It was very powerful to read that. It was very powerful. Yeah.
It's also, definitely.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's also the Georgetown set. I've spent personally, I've spent a lot of my time looking at World War II and the excitement of all that. But that time after, I've not spent a lot of time kind of thinking about what was that transition from the end of the war to now it's the Cold War as we know it today, through history. So it was fascinating to read about that.
Yeah, it was a strange time in Washington, totally different from now. I mean, my uncle and father would have men for dinner in the evening that they had excoriated in the morning in a column. And it was a given. And everybody fought big political fights. And somebody said, if there isn't a good party at Joe Alsop's until somebody slams out the door, so that was, but it was, there was it was very friendly too. It was very, there was much better conversation back and forth. And you would go, I mean, as my mother did when she was 18, she arrived in Washington. Uncle Joe said to my father, let's do this column together, matter of fact, but we have to interview everybody. And she'd find herself sitting next to Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court Justice, or the latest diplomat, or the ambassador from France, or so.
Didn't she have dinner with FDR, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt within like a month or two of being in?
That's right.
Because of relatives.
It was in April. She actually, so my great-grandmother was Theodore Roosevelt's sister. My grandmother was Eleanor's first cousin, and they were very close. So actually, Daddy knew cousin Eleanor quite well. So Daddy and Mommy went and saw Eleanor, and FDR dropped by and said, Stuart, good to see you. So it was all in the family at that point. It's very strange.
And what a disruptive shock it must have been for her. The war is happening. She's pregnant. She arrives in the United States. She's just completely deer caught in the headlights, I'm guessing, you
Yeah,
know?
an 18-year-old pregnant.
Yeah.
18. Daddy was 30.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a big gap in age.
Yeah. But she was
I think
formidable.
she was formidable, very courageous, very strong. And I think she took a look at England and London during the war and said, I want out of here. She'd been through it all. She'd been through the dust. She'd dragged furniture out of burning buildings. She'd seen the Scottish church across the street bombed to smithereens. She didn't want to be a part of post-war England. It
Yeah.
would have, and it was a grim, grim place for many
Yeah.
years afterwards. So she
Yeah.
was grateful to be in America,
Good.
but young, pregnant, homesick. She was Catholic. So as I say in the book, she conceived 12 children and she birthed 7 of us. I had a baby sister who died and she lost the other 5.
That was
So
heartbreaking.
heartbreaking.
That was heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking.
And there was a
Yeah.
lot of that in the book where I was kind of laughing and crying.
Yeah.
And it was
Back
like
and
you and I
forth.
were sitting across from each other in armchairs and you were just telling me these stories. And it was so engrossing. It was wonderful. It was really, really well done. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. So both of your parents were absolutely fascinating. As you've said, you started with your father thinking, or when you started this, and
Yeah.
you're thinking both of your parents, right? But your mother's story was so much more compelling. So how long did it take you to kind of research their lives? And did, as a child, you know something about your parents, but as an adult, you look at it differently. And now you had this layer of researching their lives to such an extent. So how did it change the way that you felt about your parents, your perception of your parents?
That's a really good question. I think it mostly changed my perception of my mother. You know, I knew her as a child as someone, as I said somewhere in the book, who really didn't like her children to get too close. You know, she would be impatient by a clinging child. So she was distant, and I really had no understanding or empathy for what she had been through to get to America. So the research showed me that all the way down to the little bits and pieces where I found out exactly what she discovered from an agent in Norway about the SS Tirpitz, which was a famous German destroyer that the British were very nervous about, very scared about. Yeah. So, you know, here she is. She was 17 knocking on the door of the admiral's office saying, you have to know this. I've just scrambled with this agent. So, as you say, formidable. But at the same time, very distant. And so I did not know her as a child. What I did do, besides taping her stories, and she once said to me in her dementia, she said to a friend, my daughter is writing my autobiography, which always made me smile. And I just nodded. I also videotaped her. So in the videotapes, I have pictures of her of her childhood in Gibraltar with a photo album in front of her. And that elicited an amazing number of memories. And nobody had asked her. She said very clearly to me, nobody ever wanted to know where I came from. And when she first came to the United States, she would go in the corner at a dinner party and all the soldiers, the former soldiers, would gather around her because she had been through it with them.
She could have she could have a real conversation with them. Yeah.
Whereas that made the American women very jealous.
Oh, yeah.
She was young, she was beautiful, and she had been there, and they had not. So I came away, and I hope the book shows this, with all of the problems and complications of our childhood, my childhood with her. I came away with a huge respect for what she had been through and an awareness of her courage.
Yeah.
She was a courageous person.
Yeah. And when we talk about complicated and your relationship with her being complicated, it was your childhood on the one hand, and then unfortunately your father passed away, but that changed your mother's life and the view and the actions that she took in her life. And she ended up becoming more of her own person. And that's kind of the person that you got to know kind of after your childhood. And
there were 3 stages. There was the childhood, My father died when she was 48, young, right? He was 60, died of leukemia. And at 51, she got sober. And so from the age of 51 to the age of about 81, I had my mother. And then at 81, she began to slide into dementia. And I thought, I'm losing her again. You know, didn't have her as a child, and I was losing her at the end. And what the conversations we had and the interviews and me bringing up all these ancient documents from the basement that were, you know, came from Gibraltar, it gave us a way to talk to each other that a lot of people with dementia, you know, they can't hit the ball back across the net.
Right.
But if you go back to those early memories, I used to play her Vera Lynn's songs from World War II as a way to just jog her memory and get her back in that time. And so I was incredibly grateful for the middle 30 years and for the way I was able to bridge the dementia gap between us at the end.
And who knows that you might not have extended the time period that you
That she was with me.
Yeah. That she was with you. Yeah. And the quality of time that you had with each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Which kind of leads into my next question, which was in the memoir, you're candid and honest about, you know, her alcoholism and how it affected you. And I wanted to ask you about this feeling, and I think you've kind of just answered it, is that it's therapeutic to be writing about this, and it helps you kind of understand, would you say, better and forgive and move on from, maybe. I don't know. Did that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I did go through therapy. I did go through 12-step program as a child of an alcoholic. So I'd done a lot of that work.
Yeah.
I also wrote a novel called Knock Knock, Who's There? About two boys whose father dies of a blood disease, and after he dies, they discover their mother's an alcoholic. I published that novel about 2 years after she got sober. And it precipitated an extremely honest conversation between the two of us. And it took some years for us to heal that. That was a wound for her, although she understood it intellectually. Yeah. So I did do one layer of peeling at that point, but you're behind the character. You're Wizard of Oz again, you know. Now this one, I stepped out front stage. It was therapeutic, and I did learn a lot, and I did come full circle, especially in the end when I found what I call the postcard from the grave, where I found after she died in her notes, in her desk, an entire series of notes that she had given she was very involved with hospice, at a conference. And it revealed not only had she lived a self-examined life, which I had dismissed and didn't think she had, and she was a great storyteller.
That's a total gift. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So you've had so much success in the literary field. What advice would you give to authors or potential authors from your experience?
Never give up. It's as simple as that.
Wow.
Stay close to what you want to write about, which is, you know, tough. They say, oh, you have to do this or that. I wrote a historical novel called Counting on Grace when everybody said nobody's reading historical novels. I wrote Castle in the Attic when, believe it or not, there was a time in children's books there were no fantasy novels, nothing beyond C.S. Lewis, you know, and way before Harry Potter. And I was told, oh, this will never do well. Don't pay attention. Yeah. Stay close to your book, close to your desk, you know, and keep going no matter what. Even if it's 15 minutes a day, stay in touch with your characters. Don't let months go by. Don't let weeks go by. Just come and visit them. And when they're really alive, it's funny. I'll go out to breakfast and I'll come in and they're sitting on the couch behind me saying, excuse me, nobody said you could. I mean, we've been waiting here for you to, you know, tell our story, get going, you know. So when you get that intimate with the people you're writing about, be it memoir, it's very important to stay close to them.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
That's lovely advice. And it hits me. It definitely hits me with Christmas time, you know, around the corner.
I know.
There's so many pulls on your time, and you just it's so easy to put it away. And So I thank you for that.
Exactly.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody's sitting there saying, really, although because I don't write under deadline, but nobody's saying, "Oh, hurry up, finish that book. We can't wait to read it." No, no.
Right. Right. It's so true. It's so true. It's pulling magic from the air. Yes.
And
Yeah.
as Fred Allen, I think it was Fred Allen, the great comedian, said, "Why write a book when you can go around the corner and buy one?"
I hadn't heard that one. That's wonderful. So true. But we need
Yeah.
writers, if we need
Yes,
them more and more.
definitely. More
We
and more
really,
storytellers,
yeah,
especially.
we
Yeah,
really do. As you say, you came out with The Castle in the Attic well before any of
yeah.
the fantasy novels of today, and now we are inundated with,
A
not inundated.
wash in them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
we're
everywhere.
awash in them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. They're everywhere.
Mm.
Exactly. So I want to talk about your website just briefly. You've got so many great things on there. You do recommended book recommendations. You obviously have a synopsis on all of the stories that you've got. You've got a travel log about your research and traveling to England and Spain to go to these places. So I highly recommend people going to your website.
Thank you.
Are you working on any new writing projects?
Yes, I forced myself to finish a prequel to The Castle in the Attic last June before I started down the publicity chute, which is, totally overwhelming when you're launching a new book. So I'm very excited. It's a first draft. So I will go back to that mainly in January and hope to have that go to the publisher soon.
Oh, that'll
And
be.
I know they would like me to do a fourth book. I'm not sure I have it in me, but I hope so. I hope so because I love the characters in that. I love the characters in those books. And the funny thing is, I have two granddaughters, twins, 13-year-olds. And at about 3 years ago, at the beginning of COVID, they helped me with the research. I gave them assignments and they responded and they helped me with the research. So I said to them, "Listen, girls, I'll put you in the book." "Oh yeah, whatever, Mima," roll of eyes. And they became completely embedded in the book. Crucial characters.
Right.
Named Sonia and Eve. They are twins. That's their names. They are twins in the book. And it was almost hard to finish the book because I had to leave them behind. It's time travel.
Yeah.
So it goes from 1943 in England to 1366 in the exact same place in Northumberland.
Wow.
And suddenly Richard, my character, had to leave them and I couldn't leave them. So anyway, that was really fun. So I'm really excited about getting back into that book.
That's really exciting. That'll be really fun to see, and we'll have to watch for it. Let us know, and reach out, let me know. That'd be great. Well, thank you again for being on the program. I really appreciate talking to you, and this is fabulous.
Well, thank you for the opportunity and the great questions and the close reading of the book. That does more for an author, as you know, than anything. Is to have someone read it and appreciate it. So true. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more, you'll find links to them through our website, capecodwriterscenter.org, through our Facebook page, and on YouTube. Thank you again for watching Books in the World.